Very educated on this.
They meant for one purpose that we follow.
That's at the
Hi
box.
everyone, welcome to the Montana Institute on Ecosystem Seminar Series. I'm Paige Tollison, I'm the Program and Communications Manager here at the IOE. There is no Rough Cut seminar next week, but the following week, Dr. Megan Lawson from Headwaters Economics will be presenting on the pleasure and pain of being an outdoor recreation community. So I hope you all can join us for that. As a reminder to our folks online, please keep your cameras and microphones off, and let's all hold our questions till the end of the seminar. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Andy to introduce our speaker.
Welcome, Daniel. It's so great to have you.
Thanks.
I'm Andy Hansen, currently the director of the IOE. Thanks for coming, folks. Great to see you and those online. Really great to have Daniel here. I guess he's really representing the several groups that have been major success stories when it comes to doing conservation around Greater Yellowstone. Typically at the scale of not the full ecosystem, but within watersheds or subset of watersheds. A scale at which maybe is socially is more functional than all of GYE. In any case, I think it's through these success stories that we ultimately are able to scale up to dealing with GYE as a whole. And I hope we'll learn more about those potentials from Daniel today. Daniel has a long history of focusing on complex environmental and social issues throughout the American West. This includes founding the Common Ground Project, which attempts to foster cross-cultural connection, collaboration, and healing for society and environment. He's currently working on with two Montana-based coalitions, Yellowstone Safe Passages and Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage. Today he's going to speak about how the more mature conservation collaboratives might even better serve GYE. Daniel, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Paige, for helping coordinate all this and get everybody here too. Nice introduction. Appreciate that. As stated, my name is Daniel, and I'm hoping for one, I've never done a hybrid event thing, so I'm hoping that folks who are online, this is kind of awkward looking at a screen here, but I know that y'all are looking at me from over there somewhere. So hopefully everybody can hear me and get through this without too much clunkiness. But name is Daniel. I grew up in Tom Minor Basin, Montana, not too far from here. I will actually show you a picture of that. There you go. Use the mouse. This is a picture of Tom Minor Basin where our family's ranch is located. Just beyond that horizon there is Yellowstone National Park. So with that being right on the edge of the park, of course, and growing up next to the park and in such a dynamic place, I'd say for all of us in the family and people who grew up there, it's an incredible opportunity. It's a very unique experience. And it also comes with this incredibly rich and complicated history. If we were to acknowledge the history, we could say, very reasonably speaking, that there were multiple tribes who lived in and visited this landscape, and depending on how far back you want to go in time. You could draw a circle around Yellowstone Park and count as many as 40 tribes who moved in and out of the land and drew sustenance and meaning from this land. So when we stand in this particular spot on the ranch and we consider all four directions, consider that time scale for people, it comes with a tremendous honor to be here at this time. It also comes with responsibility to consider what we as individuals and family members and community members are providing for this land and more than human inhabitants. And if anything, too, for me, it's an invitation to consider what kind of future we all are going to be composing together. Is that, without question in my mind, is something we're going to do. We're going to write that future. It's just a matter of how. So I'd like to just sort of place us in this ecosystem. And last week, of course, with Todd speaking, he placed us in the GYE as well. And this picture here is right in the heart of it in some ways. This is what my childhood looked like growing up in Tom Minor Basin, playing on hay bales. It was informed by an agricultural way of living in connection with the land, and of course shaped by family. We have family members who've been living in Tom Minor Basin since the mid-50s, 1950s, and both immediate family and an extended family and a growing community of folks who will come in and go out of the basin and spend time with us there at the ranch. My upbringing and to this day too is being shaped by community, not just family. So one of the interesting things I've experienced in Tom Minor is a lot of people that come in to learn about the place, to be with us and share experiences with us, and in part, we have been able to establish community and connection, and in some ways kind of incubate together and problem solve together. This is a photo of me flying a drone, one of the first drones we got on the ranch. We were kind of experimenting with how can emerging technology be used in maybe effective ways or not in a place as dynamic as Tom Minor Basin. And of course, so much of what has shaped me is living with a profound wildlife community and having an incredibly rich connection to that wildlife community. Pictured here, of course, is a fox on the ranch. Coyote. There are many creatures, great and small, that live in Tom Minor Basin and arguably in this entire region that we are now in right now. This is a wolf, not but a mile from our ranch headquarters. It looks fairly small on the screen, but actually when I was standing where that wolf was standing in the picture, it's the top of its ears would probably be right about here at hip height. And the paw prints of that wolf, I could barely get my fingers to touch together in terms of how big the paw prints were. So it's just fascinating. The picture only goes so far. When you're on the landscape with these creatures, there's a bunch more that we get to experience. Of course, we live with moose and elk, the mighty grizzly bear. There's something about growing up in a land with grizzly bears that has taught me a lot about what it means to be humble. We are not, speaking of predators, we are not the biggest apex predator on the land. There's others out there, and it's up to us to figure out how we can share the landscape with them. This too is grizzly bear cub. Although sometimes I will joke with my friends, I'll say, this is just a photo of me somehow that my wife Louise got of me before I had coffee in the morning. I'm just scraping into the cabinet looking for coffee grinds. Here's a photo of Paradise Valley. So this photo was taken via drone about 30 miles from the ranch. And why I shared all that with you just now in terms of my connection to place and family and community and wildlife and this particular landscape is that it's brought to my attention an understanding that there's always change on the land. There indeed are pressures, some of them are internal, some of them are external. You think about climate change pressures. It's big and abstract in some ways and can be very acute in other ways. But what I've learned is that we have a very strong presence on the place, humans do. And we create a lot of the challenges that we are navigating at the moment. In some respects, like we make our own bed. And so with that, there are conflicts abound. And so many of those conflicts, humans are in the middle of. And people drive this highway, and some of my work, as alluded to earlier, some of my work is in specifically road ecology and wildlife and transportation issues and conflicts, both at the local level in Paradise Valley as well as the statewide level. And when you see this photo, when I was there at the moment, you know, these vehicles are traveling so fast in this highway, and it makes me wonder how aware each of us are, individually speaking or collectively speaking, like of our impact on the land. Like, we drive so fast to this unbelievably beautiful place. How much are we actually observing at that speed? In some respects, I could think we could probably use Calvin and Hobbes as a mirror. Truth is, most of us discover where we're heading when we arrive. And that's very much like, if we were to unpack this a little bit, super linear way of thinking, sure, having a lot of fun, blasting, you know, four wheels off ground over a hill. And I remember experiences like that as a child, maybe not in a radio flyer wagon, but more like a three-wheeler. And to me, this is really telling of where we are in our society. We're doing this without question in many ways. And we're not paying attention to our surroundings, nor are we really paying attention to the vehicle or the vessel through which we do our work. And that's why I want to talk about collaboration today specifically. Because collaboration, the way I look at it, is a vehicle or a vessel for us to exist in, for us to participate in building relationships in, and for us to use, ideally, as a tool to navigate in conflicts. So, human nature conflicts in the GYE. Again, Todd Wilkinson last week did a great job of outlining and detailing some of the big bearish threats and conflicts that we face. These are just a handful that I thought of. There's so many. This is just touching it. But we argue, we scratch and claw and scream at each other over every single one of these issues in the GYE. You know, natural resources management, population growth, public land use, private land use, wildlife, water, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I mean, some of these discussions and conflicts are at all-time highs in the GYE, and I think for a really good reason. Politics and voting. How many people in this room or on the screen have received a flyer in the mail in the last week that had one side was color-coded and one side was black and white? And the narrative on one side was hero, and the narrative on the other side was villain. It's me versus you, it's us versus them. And if they get in our way or threaten us, then squash them down or fence them out. And these types of conflicts, like those are leading character traits in conflicts like this, or in the conversation, if there is one, when people try to take on some of these big early discussions. So I try to reframe that if at all possible, though, because conflict is an opportunity. Conflict is an invitation to grow and to learn. Conflict is an opportunity for us to come together, not in the sense of me versus you and us versus them, but more like the I and we kind of mentality. It's just an ethos that I carry, and I think that a lot of us carry around the work in collaboration. And collaboration at its core is the middle point where needs and opportunities meet. It's where we can raise awareness, we can align diverse interests, because there are many. We don't all have the same favorite color. That would be impossible and it would be boring. We also need to reduce conflicts. In some respects, when you look at an ecosystem trying to thrive, it needs to experience some disturbance, but too much disturbance is chronic. And it doesn't allow that ecosystem to recover and heal and grow. And we're no different, whether that's our own physical body through chronic stress and fatigue, or whether that's through our social systems, culture, belief systems, etc. Opportunities. we need to bring people together. We need to forge new relationships, and we need to explore solutions. And some of those solutions are probably already out there, and some of those solutions need to be thought of and reimagined. I look at it as human beings, though, are one of the greatest resources that we have when we combine head and heart in a way where people are bringing opportunities and needs together. And that is collaboration. It's also kind of a big deal, at least in Ron Burgundy's eyes. I couldn't help it. I had to put this on here. I was looking at collaboration memes online for at least a couple hours because you can like fall into that hole, and it's amazing how many good ones are out there. So if you have time to burn, look up collaboration memes. I actually do agree with Ron Burgundy in that particular case. So mature collaboratives, I put this in the title for a reason. It sort of alludes or sends a subtle message that there are maybe less mature collaborations or immature collaborations or collaborations that don't work. I think all those are true. The word gets tossed around a lot these days, I find, and I think we need to be pretty deliberate with our intentions when we use that word collaboration. And we need, as whether we're academics or researchers or we're practitioners or facilitators or collaborative leaders or anybody in the community who cares, we actually have an opportunity to be a little bit more specific about what it means to collaborate. And so I'm going to unpack some of that with you based on some of my observations from the last 5 years of work and professional, personal experience. A lot of it is based to Paradise Valley, but some of it's also learning from mentors in the field from other states, as well as some of my colleagues in the state of Montana. So I look at it as 4 cornerstones in terms of mature collaboratives. You have to be diverse in perspective, well-informed, interconnected, and adaptive. This could be almost a perfect mirror for how a thriving ecosystem functions. You need to have these basic cornerstones in an ecosystem for it to sustain itself, for it to be resilient. And particularly when we think about external pressures and conflicts, we can only take so many big shocks. But if we are diverse in perspective, well-informed, interconnected, and adaptive, we are more resilient to withstand those shocks. So that's a part of a mature collaborative. There are also inputs and there are outputs. And so what inputs mean is there are resources that are feeding that collaborative. And those resources could be financial, they could be intellectual capacity, and a whole variety of different resources that can be plugged into the collaborative partnership for it to be able to do these things. And then on the outside of that too, there are outputs. You know, it's fair to expect that collaborations deliver something. And it's not always just one thing. The idea of it being adaptive is that collaborations can be willing or able to listen to the particular circumstance or the conflict they're trying to navigate and allow that to evolve as years go by. Even with our partnership in Paradise Valley, the Yellowstone Safe Passages, when we first started, sure, we're still focusing on highway, wildlife, vehicle conflict issues and building awareness in that community, but our work has definitely evolved in the last few years. Our scope of work has grown, and so our outputs have also changed in time too. It's always an opportunity to reflect and ask ourselves, like, why are we doing what we're doing, and how are we contributing as a partnership? So with that in mind, I'm going to just go through a handful of suggestions or reflections that I've had based on the experience. And the first step in many ways, like where do we begin if we want to create a viable, strong, purpose-driven, collaborative partnership? In many ways, it starts by investing in community bridge builders. Like there's a lot of folks out there within these specific communities who are pretty passionate about whatever issue we're trying to navigate, might have the interest to actually lean into it and I wouldn't say that I'm a bridge builder, but I certainly was one of those people in Paradise Valley, still am, as a local person who was investing in the conversation around wildlife conflict. And it didn't take very long for a handful of partners to come on board. At the first circle were a handful of environmental NGOs who all said, hey, you're interested in this. Do you want to like take this on as a local? We'll support you. We'll provide the finances needed for your time, and we'll also bring in the knowledge base or the resources to allow you to thrive in the work as a liaison in the community. And since I've started that position as a liaison in the community, I've actually met many people across the state of Montana that are doing that exact same thing. They might not know it yet, or they're right on the cusp of being that kind of individual. I was just over in the Madison the other day, and I met two people right away. I was like, these folks could be liaisons. They could be folks that environmental NGOs and philanthropists and people who are interested in investing could invest in those individuals. So they're out there. It's one of the first steps, I think. Securing funding. None of this would work without funding. It's paying for staff time, it's paying for travel expenses, all those things. And I'm probably preaching to a crowd in that way. We all know that funding is a huge part of the story. But the collaborative process, and I underline process there, it is the part that I want to highlight. Because when we go back to inputs and outputs, it's really easy for folks to say, especially funders, to say, you know, here's a check, and this is the expectation, the outcome that I'm looking for within 12 months, or within however many months, the time frame. And oftentimes, that does not work. It's collaboration is a commitment to process more than it is to product, more than it is to outcomes. And sometimes we don't know what that time frame is going to take, what it's going to be. And that's exactly how we presented ourselves to our initial funders down in Paradise Valley. Some folks who work in philanthropy, it was like, we actually don't know how long this is going to take. It could take 10 years, if not more, to do the kind of work that we envision for this particular highway, to reduce conflicts, bring people together, build awareness, educate the public, integrate into the local schools. There's a ton of things that we could do together, but we don't know exactly how long it's going to take. And so there's a degree of trust right away in the early onset of this type of process that folks all step into together, because it's not totally clear. And I think it's a really good expectation for us to have, is to not be totally clear. Understand local perspectives. So this was an early step that I took on, and my partners, my peers and colleagues all do the same now with me too. And it's a never-ending process, but in the onset of trying to work with a collaborative partnership, we are operating in places with other people who live in those places, whether we're from there or not from there. So what we need to do is we need to engage with those people who are living in those places. And sometimes that means like getting a coffee or having a beer at a local watering hole and sitting down one-on-one with an individual in a good list of questions, asking those questions and just listening. And when we do that, when we do listen to locals, what it does as collaborative leaders or designers or facilitators, people who are investing in the process, is we get some very unique perspectives that we probably didn't see before or hear before. It makes our understanding of the issue that much more whole. So just a few examples. I mean, there's many quotes we could put on the screen, but when I was talking, asking, and reflecting with locals on the issue of wildlife on Highway 89, a few of these folks had some very interesting words. And when you start to read between those lines, it's like there's a lot of messaging that we can learn from in these responses. A lot of people can't afford to hit animals. I know people who've gotten injured so bad that it affects the rest of their life. You know, whatever would empower the community is good stuff. We need to bring people together and have a discussion on how and where we can make appropriate changes in the valley. It's like, hey, we need to have a tent to get underneath, folks, or we need to have a table where we can all chat. That's a big invitation right there from a local. A lot of people don't like change. I'm kind of that way, but I don't like seeing people get hurt. So for me, I can totally empathize with that person's perspective. I also fear change. I think some of us, many of us probably do. And when we live and grow up in a particular place and you see that change happen, it can really get you in your heartstrings. So to hear what this person is saying, but also at the same time be saying, like, but you know what? I'm not a fan of seeing people get hurt. This last part to me was another invitation to consider where the common ground is. We don't all agree on the issue from the same, or see the issue from the same angle, but we will have places that overlap in terms of our values. And so that person, a good 40 years older than me, as he was talking, is like, okay, here's where we might have some common ground and how we can start to work on from that place together. Okay, so this is straight up sort of facilitator jargon. Perform a comprehensive situation assessment. A situation assessment is indeed jargon, but it's incredibly important. What that translates to is basically do all the homework you possibly can before really diving in with a marketing or outreach or public sort of reveal on what you're trying to do. It's basically learning about anything and everything as it relates to the conflict. So I'm not going to read these in specific, but what I'm showing you are a few slides of examples. Like this is all publication as it relates to wildlife vehicle conflict, and some of it touches right down into Paradise Valley. Previous publications, research. There's also data. There can be data from previous years. There can be data that needs to be created right now to know what the situation is, to assess the situation. So draw on, again, when you have diverse perspectives at a table, more likely than not, you've got a lot of great asset right at that table. We can draw on each other in terms of our knowledge and experience to generate maps like this and or just find them if they're out there. And with that assessment, know who's at the table. So this is just one example. One conflict, wildlife vehicle conflict, in one particular watershed. Sure, this could relate to the whole state of Montana or the region, but you can see from the image there are a lot of potential people to be at this table. As folks say in the field, these are stakeholders. There's could be many words for them, but I consider it as these are potential partners. These are people we want to collaborate with. These are folks or agencies or entities that we want to invite to the table. So that's a part of the situation assessment, is just asking ourselves, who's at the table? Compile, organize, and share the knowledge. So after a while, when a person or a group of people have been doing this, then there's an opportunity, and you've already been engaging some of the community members. There's an opportunity to give that back to the community. And that's what this is. It's taking everything you've learned and giving it to the community to say, hey, okay, this is what we know. This is what also you have been saying to us. And here just on the screen is one example. There's quite a handful that we've done in Paradise Valley, but what we did was we put together a webinar with all that information, broke it into 4 different parts, developed a website, created a small little brand for ourselves. We didn't even know what to call each other as a partnership for well over a year. And finally, we got to that point of saying, okay, now we need to reveal to the community what we're up to and why, and share what we're learning. So it's a two-way street. It's both sharing and it's also inviting the community into that problem-solving space. This is the first step to inviting community into the problem-solving space. And from there, we can further engage community. And this is where the creative juices can flow like crazy. Like there are so many ways that we can engage communities. Depends on where we are. Specifically, Paradise Valley, we've done a variety of things with Yellowstone Safe Passages at least. You know, we try to have some fun, make hats. We sell hats. I mean, we're not in it to make money on hats, but it's surprising how many people have purchased these hats. And are essentially like, yeah, we get that. We want to support this work. Of course, we had to think pretty creatively about branding and name and why and all those details. And it's an entirely different conversation just on its own. But this too, we invited community members to figure this out with us. Of course, speaking to the community, getting out in front of folks. We even have folks who've helped participate in some of the work that we do. This is not, we're not in it to pick up baling twine, but this just happened to be an activity that a couple of my colleagues were doing when they were monitoring the highway and looking at fences that are right along the highway. All this baling twine, and then the local person's like, I want to go out there with you. And she's like, this woman is just like that, become a local champion of the work because she's engaged. We also hear, like this picture here, there's a lot there and you can't see it in detail, of course, but what this is citizen science. So also, we've invited the community to be in a problem-solving space by being citizen scientists. And so when they drive the highway, they're collecting data for us. You can see the data right there. You can actually go to the website and get right in. You can see the latest version of the map. And there's data points. There's all this stuff, information that community members can be a part of creating. And then that goes back to then sharing it back out with that community again. One of our things that we did probably 6 months ago was a pint night type thing at a local bar where we showed some maps on citizen scientists and we invited the folks who were doing the data collecting and said, hey, thank you, by the way. Like, this is what you've created for us and we have more work to do. Work closely with rural community members. I couldn't stress this particular recommendation enough in Montana right now. In many respects, that goes back to the political flyer I was referring to that we receive in the mail. You know, a lot of these places that we want to live in or go visit, participate in, are rural communities. And rural community members, to be honest, a lot of rural community members feel like they are not heard or listened to. Whether that's perceived or real is an entirely different thing. The point is that we need to make time for rural community members. And that goes back to those interviews, some of the interviews that I was doing with folks at the outset of our work, but also even more specifically right now what we're working on. Like we are putting maps on tables where locals can draw on those maps and put their knowledge down on paper. It's like where, in this particular case, wildlife vehicle conflict, where wildlife on the highway from your knowledge? You know, what are the landscape features and the attractions that draw wildlife to the highway or across it? Where are the most conflicts? What are the seasonal movements? What type of wildlife? Like there's a ton of knowledge out there from the locals that generally is not asked for or harvested. And so for a collaboration, if you build that ethos and you build that theoretical tent that's big enough, then you invite those landowners and rural community members under that tent and you start to do some work. So what we can do with these maps, draw on them and then digitize it. And then we'll have a layer, a data layer, that is knowledge, even if it's anecdotal. It's knowledge from the locals. The product of recommendations for solutions for this particular issue, which could be in the end, you know, wildlife overpasses over the highway or other types of mitigation efforts. That document that makes recommendations for those solutions has been created in part by these locals because they've contributed to it. So it's not just a document that some expert or an agency person or somebody from outside creates in advance and then comes to the community and says, okay, hey, we've got it figured out here. Can you sign off on this, or can you agree on this, or if anything, we've just got it figured out. So this is an opportunity to bring community members into it, and it's critical. So one of the last recommendations I have is to use multiple meeting settings. I know that everybody here is going to understand what I'm getting at. The photo in the top center is what we're all like way too used to now. Zoom meetings, virtual meeting spaces. Yeah, I mean, without question, I'm taxed in that space. However, there are times when it's useful. And we've had many moments where we've been able to meet with agency folks and personnel who you typically don't get access to if you're trying to have coffee with them or set up a professional in-person meeting, and Zoom has allowed that. Or Teams, like there's a couple different software out there that we use, right? But there are other types of meeting spaces too, and it's important to think about all of them. So we have community halls, like here and up top left, where people can meet. You know, just the basic rectangular hall with fold-out chairs, and you know, you get people in there and provide some coffee and cookies and see what happens. Like there's a lot of potential that we can work together in those spaces, and we've been doing that. But there's also meeting spaces like this one up here. This is out on the ranch in an aspen grove, or this one here. This is a room in the upstairs of our barn at the ranch where people are gathered in a circle. There's also here, there's campfires. I couldn't stress it enough. I mean, personally speaking, there's no better place to have a difficult conversation than sitting around a campfire, in my opinion. I mean, if you feed people and they might have a place to go to the bathroom, then you're just fine sitting around a campfire. But I think that our culture has really gotten used to these types of settings, where people are sitting in tables and chairs and in a room, and you're inside, and you know, maybe one person like myself is just giving a lot of information, right? Where we co-evolved with a campfire. Human beings created our languages, our belief systems, our religions, our capitalist, you know, economic frameworks. We've created almost everything around campfires. And so why not use that as an opportunity for collaboratives in this sense, to be more intimate? And I think that word intimacy is really key here. Like the more that we can incorporate all of these, the better, of course, but we really need to start anchoring more into the intimate spaces in order to build really strong relationships. And the last is strive to build a culture of trust. Admittedly, this is a very vague and slightly abstract request. It's actually really daunting for me right now to consider how difficult it is for people to understand this in this particular day and age. Going back to that flyer that we've all received in the mail, how can we possibly trust this information that we get in our mailboxes? And how can we possibly trust each other if the exchange, the dialogue exchange is over a Facebook post? Like that type of culture is definitely not something that I want to participate in or help redesign in a way. What I believe in more than anything are what I've started to learn are 3 R's. And I believe that collaboration and conflict, if anything, has so much more to do with relationships. And in terms of building trust, it's about honoring relationships first. If we were to consider drawing a line between each one of us in this room, an imaginary thread, there'd be quite a variety and a whole lot of threads that would weave into a web or some type of fabric. And whether your favorite color is blue or mine is red or something else, that doesn't matter. It's actually that what we have in common is the relationship that we share with each other. And so the question is, what am I putting into that web? How am I influencing it? And so collaborative leadership and collaborative partnerships consider that bigger frame of a web of network, a web of relationships. And with that, we have to have respect. Again, when we go back to the slide about all the conflicts, the scratching and the clawing and the biting and the arguing, none of that will work for us in the end, in my experience. And so collaborative partnerships can really, really send this message well when we talk about respect. Because if we do create that tent that's big enough for people to get under, then we can espouse this. We can honor the relationship over that of the conflict or over that of the outcome that we're trying to shoot for, and we can just carry respect in the dialogue. And lastly, the third R is reciprocity. It's less about what am I getting out of this and more about what are you getting out of this. And with that, naturally, that invites this idea of how can this be mutually beneficial? I mean, it sounds a little panacea, and collaboration will not work every time. I know that. Sometimes we need to assert more. Sometimes we need to go to litigation. Sometimes we're just pushed into the corner. But I genuinely believe that the foundation of our connection to place as social creatures, both place meaning human as well as the landscape, lies in relationships, respect, and reciprocity. And I'm going to end with this slide. It just reminds me of, and there's a subtle lesson in this, it's the last suggestion. Reminds me of Sherry Mitchell, who is a wonderful woman, very well-written scholar, academic, environmental activist, indigenous leader. She lives in the New England states of the United States. And one of her lines is, one of the best things that we can learn to do is listen. It enhances nearly every aspect of our lives. So with that particular quote, the invitation is thinking, how are we listening? When I'm meeting with a local landowner or community member at the bar or the coffee shop, and they just want to rant and rail about whomever is the issue, I can listen to specifically the words that that person's saying, but I can also listen in a much deeper way. There's trauma there. At the core of every trauma is a degree of separation, even a tiny one. Separation from self, separation from family, separation from land, from culture, from language, from food. Like, that's how trauma functions, is it separates. And so to heal is to come back together, in a nutshell. And listening, in my experience so far, is like the first really potent ingredient to that type of soup that we get to experience together that actually can heal. Just listening. I really do believe that mature collaboratives, when they're fully whole, are ones that know how to listen really, really well. Individuals within that partnership and the collaborative sort of mission at large is quite actively listening. And I'll stop there so we can have time for questions.
Got a question. You describe a sort of careful and deliberate process of bringing people together and doing that situation assessment, and in your case, focusing on the transportation network. And then you have an event like we had this spring, a 1,000-year flood affecting the entire ecosystem and certainly also those transportation networks. How did your group react to the situation that you were looking at changed dramatically? What was any?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Super relevant time too. Well, there's two things that happen when I think about answering the question. The first thing is that for our group focusing on Highway 89, we, of course, was met right away, and we considered, okay, well, how does this influence our work? How is this going to change how and who and when and where we engage this community right now? Because this is a big deal that the community really needs to get around together. So if anything, we wanted to subtly disengage in our work so we could create more space for community members to rally, because that was what was happening. And in the face of, and it's still happening, in the face of that big flood, it's impressive how many people came together. It's really, really impressive how when a very real and tangible and threatening conflict comes in like a flash point, people rally. So we didn't want to disturb that. If anything, we wanted to support it. So we subtly shifted our perspective just a little bit and considered, well, maybe we can support the flood event right now in different ways, and we'll take our lens off the highway just at the moment, just for a short period of time, and stop basically taking up airtime in that space. And knowing, trusting that we would come back and hone back in on the highway and what we were trying to do there. But it took, I'd be interested in what my colleagues might say, but reflecting back on it, it probably was a couple months of time for us to just sort of back off and allow the community to just really, in many ways, thrive, trying to, coming together in that conflict. So I hope I answered your question.
I have a question. Are you familiar with the events over in Idaho, not far from here? And the DOT over there thought, oh, we'll build an overpass. And so, the wildlife can get back and forth. And I think it made the High Country News as an article, and it just blew up into this anti-government rant. And the overpass didn't happen. So what's your opinion, impressions of that whole episode?
I am familiar with that episode. It's too bad it turned out the way it did. And not to say it's not anybody's fault. There's not like you can't just point a finger at a particular detail in that story and say, okay, that's why. But there are some tenets to what I just shared on the screen here that were not applied in that community and maybe could have been. The other thing that really is important that I did not talk about today, and I'm glad you asked this question, is like the value of and the impact, whether it's positive or negative, of storytelling, of media, and the role that media plays in all of it. And so what happened in Idaho was it didn't take much for a fairly small group of people to run with a narrative, to craft a narrative and run with it, and use the available tools, web-based blogs and print in the local newspaper and such to get that narrative out in front of the community and really out in front of the work that people were trying to do and halt it. Like it literally put a stop to that work in a very short period of time. And that narrative in many ways was so successful because it sort of impregnated the political arena. So politicians, when they can run with it, if it helps their constituents or it helps them retain votes. Unfortunately, that's what happened in Idaho. It's not going to happen like that everywhere because I think there's more integrity in a lot of the other communities, and there's certainly tons of integrity in that community still. And people are still trying to work on it. But what that does is it elevates the importance for us to consider our messaging, and consider when we want to put together public-facing messages and how and who's involved. What voices are included in that messaging so we can craft together a much more accurate narrative on what's happening. I mean, that was a very classic scenario of misinformation just run wild. So for us, even in Paradise Valley, we are very careful with how we put ourselves out there and in terms of like narrative form. And we're going to do it more and more, of course, because we have to. But yeah, it's a good question.
Just following that, Daniel, are you seeing some of the collaboratives leading to outcomes that substantially improve conservation? And if so, do you think that what can be done at a Paradise Valley scale could be done at a GYE scale? Could we work towards collaborative successes at the full ecosystem scale?
I think yes, we can. But those collaborative circles need to be at the smallest nested scale first. Nested scales is like local community first, and then scale out from there, or multiply across the land and network. So to answer the first part of your question of it, definitely are collaborative partnerships that are, without question, making wonderful efforts and accomplishments in the conservation circles and in circles around social justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And so like there's one entity, for example, in the storytelling space called Stories for Action. That is, at the moment, that's the priority is focus on the collaborative partnerships around the state of Montana and tell their stories. So more and more people are aware of what these folks are up to around the state, because there's a ton of great work that's happening. And we have, from agricultural circles trying to navigate drought issues and extractive industry issues in central and eastern Montana to there's some really great things happening right now in tribal communities and people who are non-native who are working within tribal communities trying to work together. Forest management. You kind of name the conflict and there's probably likely a partnership either already well formed and established or in the process of coming together in the state of Montana. And I think the bridging, like the storytelling and cross-pollinating that can happen between those communities is where the really rich potential is to a landscape scale. Like when we can cross-pollinate and learn from each other across the whole region within a short period of time, then there's massive potential. And I couldn't even fathom what that might be, but I do believe it.
I have a question from online. Samuel Koshel asks, are there opportunities for groups like RMEF to step up and fund projects or work for the Highway 89 Safe Passage program? Maybe a better question would be, where do you see RMEF and others helping with Yellowstone Safe Passage?
Yeah, absolutely. So case in point would be if we look to our neighboring state, Wyoming. When it comes specifically to wildlife and transportation issues, sporting groups in Wyoming were a major force in support of the work, supporting the collaborative processes that I was trying to talk about a little earlier, and then also generating awareness and generating funding. And literally what I heard from presenters talking about stories in Wyoming was they were looking under every rock for answers or ideas or solutions or partners. And RMEF, Muley Fanatics, there's a bunch of sporting groups that were right away invested, saying, yeah, we agree, this is a big deal, let's figure out how to work on it together. In Montana, we have a lot of room for growth in that arena, particularly developing these strategic and pointed partnerships with sporting groups, both sort of the hook and bullet community, as well as sort of the rural, remote landowner community that I was referring to on the screen. Tons of potential. And yes, absolutely, they can play a big role.
So hi, I really enjoyed your talk. Diane Zabisky from Ecology. One thought that some of us have had over this past several years is that our graduate students, some of whom are in the audience, get really good training in, for example, in our department, to do statistics and to do biological assessments and to write scientific papers and even to do pretty decent scientific communication to the public. But the one thing that would be really great for them to learn would be some of the skills that you're talking about, which are, we don't have classes on things like that. So I think that there are some opportunities for partnerships, which we've thought about in the past, but haven't quite come to realize. But I'll follow up with you on that because I think there's some really neat ways that we could do skill building, because a lot of our students are not necessarily going to go into academia, and that's fine, after they're done. And so we want them to be able to have a toolbox of skills that they can apply to help solve conservation problems.
Absolutely. I think it's a really necessary and critical thing, and it makes me think of, at the risk of disturbing some folks in the room, I went to grad school at so, it's one of those things. I did go to undergrad here many years ago, but what drew me to University of Montana was a program called Natural Resources Conflict Resolution. And it's a graduate level program focusing on exactly what you're talking about. How do you, and it's integrated among various departments. Students from across the university will attend those classes. And it's really trying to have the conversation and teach the next generation, really, like how do we have productive and meaningful and respectful conversations? How do you listen, really? And then how do you reflect effectively what we're hearing? A lot of that type of work is mediation, negotiation, facilitation. It's not just about resolving conflict. It's more about how to design collaborative partnerships. And that's a great program. And it could totally happen here too, and it should.
Daniel, would you describe, let's say the conversation around fire or really constructive, evolving conversations in the church boardroom or whatever, where those occur. Could you describe how the conversation changes and evolves, sort of deepens through whether it's really good listening or I'd love to hear a little bit of the transformative aspect of how conversations move from the early greetings deeper, because that's a lot of the skills I think that we all strive for.
Yeah. It's a hard one to answer, but I'll
Just
try.
sort of the character of the conversation.
Yeah, so if I place myself into, like I'm going to a meeting at the local community hall, which I'll be doing this evening, I am in some respects already there. I'm already, like I know my intention for the meeting. I'm beginning to consider like what I'm going to be doing in that meeting, and I also kind of know what I'm going to be doing after that meeting. And stepping into the room, it feels, it feels like workspace. It feels very cerebral. And so, and not to say that that's a bad thing, but when I'm building a fire for people to get around, or when I'm invited to a campfire, in this particular case, I already know that I have more time because I'm spending time at a fire, more likely than not camping overnight. And the arena that we're playing in is much bigger. So when on the land, I think the landscape draws so much from us, and we draw from it. Mentally, cerebrally, we're not just here when we're sitting around the fire. It's a lot more of this. So the feeling of being around the fire and the difference there is that people, in many ways I've experienced, people just sort of drop in to a place way more effectively and smoothly than they would at the community hall. It's a much more natural invitation. And I'm guessing you could just consider yourself sitting around a fire with your friends, like the last time you did that, maybe this summer. Like, what did that feel like? When you put some intention into that fire, or you have it purpose-driven, like that gathering is there for a reason, it's amazing how one person, all there's needed is one person to go to a vulnerable place. Like one person might just crack open just a little bit to allow. There's definitely no more head. It's all heart. It's full body. There's tears involved. It's very vulnerable and open. And what happens when that experience happens with a group is everyone goes into a place of empathy in a second. We all drop into that place with that individual, whether we're experiencing that person's experience specifically or not. So I think the landscape just has a natural way of doing that for us. It's both being safe and vulnerable at the same time, which is really fascinating. And I think what happens when we're in the space together in community versus that of just picture yourself by a fire by yourself. Like when we're there to share it with people, that's when we start to rewrite the narrative because we're literally doing it in real time. And I've watched people very intensely kind of like digesting and trying to understand or grapple or reflecting, and they're staring at the fire as they're doing it in a very vulnerable and open way. And everybody else around that circle is just staring at the fire. And they're all just there, and the fire is there. The fire, like, literally is transforming in front of us, and as are we. So you can't find, I can't find that type of feeling in a rectangular room. It's just, it barely ever happens. I genuinely think it's because the land is, it's sort of encouraging it of us.